In the heat of battle, one soldier's defiance changed the course of war. A single gunner, ignoring direct orders, unleashed a firing pattern that commanders deemed unauthorized, but would later be studied in military academies worldwide. His split-second decision obliterated an advancing Panzer column that threatened to break Allied lines. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. December 18, 1944. The world lay muffled under a heavy blanket of snow that stretched across the rolling terrain near Neuville, Belgium. The trees stood as silent sentinels, their branches bowing under the weight of winter's embrace. Inside the cold steel hull of an M10 Wolverine, Private First Class Ray Thompson steadied his breath, watching as it formed small clouds in the frigid air. The tank destroyer's interior was a cramped symphony of metal and machinery, offering little protection against the biting cold that seeped through every seam. Ray adjusted his position, his fingers tracing the familiar controls of the gun mechanism. His mind wandered briefly to his family's wheat fields in Kansas, where he'd learned to read the land and sky with patient precision. "Those same nothing but snow and more snow," Ray replied, his tone measured and calm despite the gravity of their situation. He'd always been the steady one, even back home when summer storms threatened to destroy the harvest. Sam Harlan, their driver, remained silent at his station, occasionally adjusting the idling engine to keep it from freezing in the brutal cold. The vehicle hummed beneath them, a mechanical heartbeat in the otherwise deathly quiet forest. The three men had been positioned on this ridge since before sunrise, following Captain Douglas Langston's strict orders to maintain observation of the forest crossroads below. Intelligence had reported German armor moving through the sector, part of the massive counteroffensive that had caught the Allied forces by surprise days earlier. Ray wiped away condensation from his viewing port, revealing the vast white landscape that stretched toward the horizon. The Ardennes forest had become an unexpected battleground, its peaceful beauty now a deceptive mask for the violence that lurked within its depths. "You think they're really coming this way?" Hayes whispered, breaking the silence again. Ray nodded, remembering the grim determination in Captain Langston's eyes during the briefing. "The captain wouldn't have us freezing our asses off up here if he wasn't certain." The gunner returned to his vigil, eyes scanning methodically across their sector. His notebook, a gift from his mother filled with sketches and equations, pressed against his chest, inside his coat pocket, a reminder of the engineering future he hoped would follow this war. For now, though, his entire world had narrowed to this ridge, this moment, and the weight of responsibility that rested on his trained eye and steady hand. "Observe. Do not engage." Captain Douglas Langston's voice crackled through the static of their last working radio, the only functional communication device in their M10 Wolverine. His tone carried the weight of absolute command, leaving no room for interpretation. Inside the cramped steel confines, Private First Class Ray Thompson exchanged meaningful glances with his crew. The captain's orders were clear, but something in Ray's gut told him that simple observation might not be enough today. The methodical gunner ran his gloved fingers along the firing controls, feeling the cold metal beneath the worn leather. "You heard the captain," Corporal Leonard Hayes muttered, his breath visible in the frigid air. The loader shifted uncomfortably, anxiety evident in his twitching fingers. "We're just the eyes out here, nothing more." Sam Harlan, their reliable driver, nodded silently from his position. The youngest of the three, he kept his focus on maintaining their concealed position, engine idling just enough to prevent freezing in the Belgian winter. "Intel says they've got at least 4 Tigers in that column," Ray said quietly, his Kansas drawl barely audible over the tank destroyer's mechanical hum. "If they spot us first?" Hayes nervously checked their ammunition supply, a habit he'd developed since joining the unit 3 weeks prior. "Then we'll be nothing but a smoking hole in the snow." The radio crackled again. "Thompson, Confirm receipt of orders. Langston's voice had an edge to it, as if he could somehow sense Ray's hesitation from miles away at the command post. Order received, sir, Ray responded, his voice steady despite his reservations. Observe only. When he released the transmission button, Ray pulled out his notebook from inside his coat. The pages were filled with precise calculations and diagrams, trajectories, armor penetration angles, and timing sequences. His mother's gift had become more than just a symbol of his engineering aspirations. It had become a tactical advantage. What happens if they turn toward Noville? Harlan asked, breaking his usual silence. There's nothing between them and our boys there. Ray studied the terrain through his periscope, mentally calculating distances and angles. Then Captain Langston will have to send new orders. Hayes snorted. By then it might be too late. The corporal's fingers drummed nervously against the shell he'd already prepared, despite the orders not to engage. The three men fell silent, each contemplating the weight of their position. They were the forward observers, the early warning system, but also potentially the first line of defense. Through the viewport, Ray could see dark clouds gathering on the horizon, mirroring the storm of conflict brewing inside him. Sometimes, Ray whispered, more to himself than to his companions, the right action isn't always in the orders. Hayes looked at him sharply, understanding dawning in his eyes. That's the kind of thinking that gets men court-martialed, Thompson. Ray nodded slowly, closing his notebook. Or the kind that saves lives. The distant rumbling came first, vibrating through the frozen ground and into the steel hull of the M10 Wolverine. Ray Thompson adjusted his position at the gunner's seat, his gloved hands steady, despite the cold that had settled into his bones during their 12-hour watch. Through the frosted periscope, he spotted the first wisps of exhaust fog rising above the tree line, dancing against the gray winter sky like phantom fingers. They're coming, he whispered, his breath forming small clouds inside the cramped compartment. Corporal Leonard Hayes shifted nervously beside him, checking the ammunition stores for the third time in as many minutes. How many? He asked, voice tight. Can't tell yet, but that lead vehicle's a Tiger. Ray recognized the distinctive sound of the German tank's engine, heavier, more deliberate than their American counterparts. Sam Harlan, hunched over the driver's controls, kept the Wolverine perfectly still, understanding that their survival depended on remaining undetected. Captain Langston's orders stand? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Observe only, Hayes confirmed, the tension in his voice betraying his unease. As the German column emerged from the distant tree line, Ray's mind began calculating trajectories, distances, and weak points, a habit formed years before on his family's farm in Kansas. Back home, he'd spent countless hours fixing machinery, learning how systems worked and failed. A tractor with misaligned gears, a combine with a damaged belt. One small failure could cascade into complete breakdown. The lead Tiger tank moved with arrogant confidence, its massive form crushing the snow beneath its treads. Behind it, Ray counted 5 more tanks and several half-tracks filled with infantry. The column moved in perfect formation, each vehicle maintaining precise distance from the next. Like dominoes, Ray murmured. What's that? Hayes asked, leaning closer. The way they're spaced, if one stops suddenly. Ray didn't finish the thought, but his mind was already mapping the chain reaction that could follow. The narrow forest road left no room for evasive maneuvers. If something blocked the path, the entire column would be forced to halt. Through the periscope, Ray watched the lead Tiger's exhaust sending more fog into the air as it navigated a slight bend in the road. The tank commander was visible in the turret, surveying the terrain with binoculars. Ray instinctively ducked lower, though he knew they were well concealed behind the ridge. They have no idea we're here, Harlan whispered. Ray nodded silently, his farmer's instincts recognizing the vulnerability in the German formation. Just like back home, where a single misaligned gear could bring the most powerful machine grinding to a halt, this column had its weak points, points that his gunner's eye couldn't help but identify. The Tiger's engine growled louder as it approached the narrowest section of the road, where tall pines created a natural bottleneck. Ray's finger hovered near the firing mechanism, not touching it, but feeling its presence like a silent promise. Private First Class Ray Thompson wasn't supposed to be inside this freezing M10 Wolverine, scanning the Belgian forest for German armor. Just 4 days earlier, he had been helping maintain supply vehicles at the battalion headquarters when word came that Charlie Company needed a replacement gunner. Their regular man, Peterson, had collapsed with a fever that wouldn't break, leaving a critical position empty as intelligence reported Panzer movements in the sector. "I can handle a gun sight," Ray had said quietly, stepping forward while others found reasons to look away. His Kansas upbringing had taught him that when work needed doing, you simply did it. The company clerk had raised an eyebrow. "Your supply, Thompson, not a tank destroyer, man. My father had me calculating trajectories for farm equipment since I was 12, Ray had replied, his voice steady. "I understand angles and distances." That wasn't the whole truth. Ray understood far more than simple trajectories. Inside his coat pocket, pressed against his chest, was his mother's parting gift, a leather-bound notebook filled with his meticulous sketches and equations. Before the war had claimed him, Ray had been accepted to engineering school. The notebook represented that deferred dream, pages filled with mechanical designs and mathematical formulas that he studied whenever a quiet moment allowed. Captain Langston had reviewed his file with skepticism. "You've had the basic training on the 76mm, but no combat experience with it." "I learn quickly, sir," Ray had answered, thinking of the complex harvesting equipment he'd not only operated but improved back home. Now, as he adjusted the periscope and felt the cold metal controls beneath his fingertips, Ray wondered if he'd volunteered out of duty or something else. Perhaps the need to apply what he understood about mechanics and motion to something consequential. The tank destroyer felt familiar somehow, its systems logical, its purpose clear. Sam Harlan, the driver, had accepted him without question, but Corporal Hayes remained distant, eyeing the newcomer with thinly veiled concern. "Peterson knew this machine inside and out," Hayes had muttered during their first night together. Ray had simply nodded, then spent hours after dark studying the gunner's manual by flashlight, adding his own annotations in the margins. When Hayes had awakened for his watch, he'd found Ray already alert, having calculated firing solutions for every approach to their position. The notebook rested now against Ray's chest, a reminder of what waited after the war, if he survived. Engineering school, creation instead of destruction, building rather than breaking. Yet, as his fingers traced the firing controls, Ray Thompson realized that sometimes the same principles that built the world could also be used to change the course of a battle. The German column emerged from the forest mist like steel ghosts, their engines growling through the snow-laden silence. Ray Thompson watched through the frosted periscope of the M10 Wolverine, his breath creating small clouds inside the cramped metal hull. The lead Tiger tank advanced cautiously, its massive bulk dwarfing the trees on either side as the Panzer formation squeezed into the narrow forest road. "Hold position," Corporal Leonard Hayes whispered unnecessarily, echoing Captain Langston's earlier orders. "We're just here to observe." Ray said nothing, his mind calculating trajectories and weak points as he had done countless times with farm machinery back in Kansas. The Tiger paused, its turret rotating slowly, scanning the ridge where they were hidden. Behind it, 5 more tanks and several half-tracks followed in tight formation, their commanders confident in their overwhelming firepower. Something in the young gunner's mind clicked as he observed the 3rd Panzer in line, a critical link in the column's structure. His fingers tightened around the firing controls. In that moment, the equations and diagrams from his notebook seemed to materialize before his eyes, revealing the perfect point of impact. "What are you doing?" Hayes hissed, noticing the subtle shift in Ray's posture. "We have orders!" But Ray had already made his decision. Without warning, he depressed the trigger, sending the shells screaming through the winter air. The report cracked the icy silence like thunder, echoing across the valley. The shell struck with devastating precision, detonating against the 3rd Panzer's vulnerable flank. A brilliant orange fireball erupted, sending shards of twisted metal skyward against the white backdrop of snow. Black smoke billowed upward as secondary explosions rocked the stricken vehicle. "Jesus Christ!" Sam Harlan shouted from the driver's seat, his hands gripping the controls in shock. "What have you done?" Hayes stared at Ray in disbelief, torn between horror at the violation of direct orders and awe at the perfect shot. The loader's hands trembled slightly as he processed what had just happened. The German column froze in confusion, tanks grinding to a halt as commanders attempted to identify the source of the attack. The Tiger's turrets swung wildly, searching for targets, while the damaged Panzer burned furiously, effectively cutting the column in half. Ray remained calm, his eyes never leaving the periscope as he adjusted his aim. "Load another," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the enormity of his insubordination. Hayes hesitated only briefly before reaching for another shell, his training overriding his doubts. As he slammed the round into place, he realized they had crossed a point of no return. Whatever happened next, they were committed to Ray's unauthorized strategy. "Target the lead vehicle next," Ray instructed, his Kansas drawl betraying no emotion as he prepared to unleash chaos on the German formation. The explosion ripped through the German column with devastating precision. Lieutenant Erich Schmidt's carefully organized formation dissolved into pandemonium as the 3rd Panzer erupted in flames. Black smoke billowed against the pristine snow, creating a surreal contrast of destruction against winter's purity. "What have you done?" Sam Harlan hissed from the driver's seat, his knuckles white on the controls of the M10 Wolverine. Ray Thompson remained silent, already calculating his next move. Through the periscope, he watched German soldiers leaping from their vehicles, their disciplined ranks replaced by frantic survival instincts. The tank commanders were shouting orders that went unheeded as panic spread through the column. "Load another," Ray instructed calmly, his Kansas drawl steadier than it had any right to be. The ice-covered road became a liability for the German tanks. A Tiger attempted to maneuver around the burning wreckage, its massive treads spinning helplessly on the slick surface. Metal ground against metal as vehicles collided in the narrow forest passage. The precision of German engineering meant nothing now. The column had become its own worst enemy. Corporal Hayes worked the loading mechanism with practiced efficiency. Despite his trembling hands, "Captain Langston will have us court-martialed," he muttered, but passed another shell nonetheless. Ray ignored the comment, adjusting his aim toward the lead tank. The explosion had created exactly what he'd anticipated, a bottleneck. The disciplined Panzer formation, so intimidating in open terrain, was now compressed into a vulnerable line with limited mobility. Through the smoke, Schmidt could be seen frantically waving his arms, trying to restore order. The German commander's face was a mask of disbelief as his column, which had been advancing confidently just moments before, descended into chaos. 3 degrees left, Ray instructed Sam, who complied without question. The tank destroyer shifted position, presenting a different firing angle. A secondary explosion thundered through the forest as ammunition cooked off in the burning Panzer. The blast sent shrapnel flying in all directions, forcing more German crews to abandon their vehicles. Pine trees nearest the explosion caught fire, their sap igniting with surprising ferocity. Ray's forbidden shot had transformed the orderly advance into a desperate scramble. German tank crews, trained to fight as a coordinated unit, now acted individually, some attempting to reverse course while others tried to push forward. The result was gridlock. "They think we're a full battery," Hayes observed, a note of awe creeping into his voice as he watched the Germans. Disorganized response. Ray nodded slightly, already lining up his second shot. He knew that in warfare, perception often mattered more than reality. His single M10 Wolverine, through calculated positioning and precise firing, was creating the illusion of a much larger force. As the chaos unfolded before them, one thing became clear. The German column's strength had become its weakness. Corporal Leonard Hayes felt his hands trembling as he reached for another shell. The realization hit him like shrapnel. Ray Thompson was firing without orders. The loader glanced at their gunner, whose face remained a mask of concentration, eyes fixed through the periscope of their M10 Wolverine. There was no hesitation in Ray's movements, only calculated precision. "What the hell are you doing?" Hayes whispered, his voice barely audible over the thunder of their cannon. Captain Langston said observe only. Ray didn't answer. Instead, he adjusted the gun elevation slightly, his fingers moving with the same methodical patience he'd shown when discussing farm equipment back at camp. Another German tank appeared in his sights. "Load," Ray said simply, extending his hand backward. Hayes froze, torn between military discipline and the undeniable effectiveness of what they were witnessing. The German column was already in disarray, 2 vehicles burning, soldiers scattering. His training demanded he report this insubordination, but something deeper, survival perhaps, or a grudging respect, pushed him toward complicity. "We're going to be court-martialed," Hayes muttered, but his hands were already moving, sliding another shell into the breach. In the driver's compartment, Sam Harlan listened to the exchange with growing tension. "New position?" he called up, somehow understanding Ray's strategy without explanation. 20 yards right, behind the fallen pine, Ray responded, never taking his eyes off the target. The tank destroyer lurched forward, treads grinding through snow and frozen earth. Hayes braced himself against the cold steel wall, watching Ray's profile illuminated by brief flashes from outside. The loader had requested a transfer just weeks earlier, finding his assigned crew too quiet, too reserved. Now, that same reserved nature had transformed into something else, a silent, deadly efficiency. As the M10 settled into position, Hayes felt something shift within him. The fear remained, but alongside it grew a strange sense of purpose. Without a word, he established a rhythm with Ray. Load, confirm, brace for recoil, repeat. No unnecessary communication, just the synchronization of 2 men who understood their roles perfectly. 3 more coming around the bend, Ray announced, his Kansas drawl steady despite the chaos. "Ready," Hayes responded, no longer questioning. The shell slid home with practiced ease. Outside, the German column continued to fracture under their assault. What had begun as insubordination was becoming something else, a masterclass in tactical precision. Hayes watched as Ray calculated each shot, never wasting ammunition, creating maximum disruption with minimal resources. In that frozen moment, as another Panzer erupted in flames, Hayes made his choice. Protocol be damned. He would follow this quiet farm boy from Kansas through whatever came next. Some forms of leadership required no rank insignia, only courage and the clarity to see what others could not. The shell left Ray Thompson's M10 Wolverine with a hollow boom, arcing through the frigid Belgian air. This round wasn't aimed at any tank, but rather at what his trained eye had identified as a fuel supply vehicle near the middle of the German column. The projectile struck with devastating precision, igniting the truck in a catastrophic explosion that sent a fireball climbing above the tree line. "My God," Sam Harlan whispered from the driver's seat, his hands frozen on the controls as the inferno erupted. The blast painted the snow-covered forest in surreal hues of orange and black, transforming the serene winter landscape into a hellscape. Burning diesel splashed across the road and surrounding vehicles, igniting smaller fires that quickly spread to the pine trees flanking the narrow passage. The acrid stench of burning fuel and scorched wood filled the air, stinging the eyes of panicked German soldiers as they abandoned their vehicles. Corporal Hayes stared through his viewport, loading another shell with hands that had stopped shaking. "They're trapped," he observed, a note of awe in his voice. He was right. The burning fuel truck had effectively cut the column in two, with flames now blocking the rear escape route. The lead tanks could still advance, but the vehicles behind the Inferno had nowhere to go except into the dense forest, a death trap for heavy armor on the snow-covered, uneven terrain. "Perfect choke point," Ray muttered, his Kansas drawl barely audible over the distant explosions as secondary ammunition stores caught fire. The crew watched as German soldiers scattered into the woods, their dark uniforms stark against the white snow. Some attempted to organize a response, but the unexpected attack had shattered their cohesion. The Panzer crews, trained to fight as a coordinated unit, now found themselves isolated and disoriented. Through the periscope, Ray could see Lieutenant Schmidt gesticulating wildly, trying to regain control of his disintegrating command. The German officer's face was illuminated by the flames, his expression shifting between rage and disbelief as his column, which had been advancing with such confidence minutes earlier, now burned before his eyes. Inside the American tank destroyer, the air grew thick with tension and purpose. Sam repositioned their vehicle with subtle movements, keeping them hidden while providing Ray with clear firing lanes. The three men had found their rhythm now, working in near silence, communicating through nods and gestures. "Captain Langston's going to court-martial us all," Sam said, but there was no regret in his voice. Hayes loaded another shell, the metallic clank echoing in the confined space. "Only if we lose," he replied, a grim smile crossing his face. The corridor of fire had transformed the battlefield in their favor. What had been an overwhelming enemy force was now a scattered, trapped collection of individual units, precisely what the M10 had been designed to hunt. Ray Thompson shifted the M10 Wolverine into its third position of the hour, the tank destroyer's treads grinding softly against the snow-packed earth. Through his periscope, he spotted another Panzer, its silhouette vulnerable against the burning backdrop of forest. With mathematical precision, he adjusted his aim, accounting for distance, wind, and the slight incline of their position. "Ready," he whispered to Leonard Hayes, who loaded another shell with hands that no longer trembled. The loader had found his rhythm now, moving in perfect synchronization with Ray's commands. The shot thundered across the ridge, striking the German tank's flank. Metal screamed as the shell penetrated, followed by a secondary explosion that sent the turret cartwheeling through the air. "Move," Ray instructed Sam Harlan. The driver immediately engaged the engine, relocating the Wolverine 200 yards east along the tree line. From their new vantage point, Ray observed the chaos below. German soldiers scrambled between burning vehicles, shouting orders that contradicted one another. 3 Tigers remained operational, but their commanders were firing blindly into the forest, unsure where the attacks originated. "They think we're everywhere," Hayes muttered, peering through his own viewport. Ray nodded. "That's exactly what we want." He had calculated each firing position to create the illusion of multiple tank destroyers, a ghost battery haunting the pines. A German officer, perhaps Lieutenant Schmidt himself, stood atop a half-track, frantically directing his men toward the eastern flank. Ray tracked him through the scope, but held his fire. The panicking officer was doing more damage to German morale than another shell could accomplish. The radio crackled with distant chatter. American reconnaissance had spotted the column's disarray. Captain Langston would know of their disobedience by now, but Ray pushed the thought aside. The mission had evolved beyond orders. 2 more shells, Ray told Hayes, who nodded grimly. They struck with surgical precision. 1 round disabled the lead Tiger's track, blocking the narrow forest path. The second hit a fuel truck attempting to reverse, creating a wall of flame that cut off retreat. German soldiers began abandoning their vehicles, fleeing into the woods on foot. Some fired wildly into the forest, convinced they were surrounded by an entire American battalion rather than a single tank destroyer. "They're breaking," Harlan whispered, almost disbelieving. Ray watched as the once mighty column dissolved into scattered groups of frightened men. Already, he could hear the survivors' stories forming. Tales of ghost tanks appearing and disappearing among the pines. Of an impossible American force that struck from everywhere and nowhere. Hayes placed a hand on Ray's shoulder. "How did you know this would work?" Ray thought of his notebook, of the patterns and calculations that had always made sense to him when little else did. "Sometimes," he replied quietly, "the most powerful weapon isn't the shell. It's making them believe what you want them to believe." Lieutenant Erich Schmidt stood rigid in the commander's hatch of his Panzer, his face a mask of disbelief as he surveyed what remained of his once proud column. Just 3 hours earlier, he had briefed his officers with absolute certainty, pointing to the map with confident gestures. The Americans were in disarray. Intelligence had confirmed it. This forest passage would be nothing more than a formality before they reached the Allied supply depots. Now, that certainty lay shattered like the burning hulk of the third tank in his formation. Black smoke billowed into the winter sky, casting apocalyptic shadows across the snow. The lieutenant gripped his binoculars tighter, scanning the ridge for any sign of the enemy force. How many tank destroyers were up there? A full company? A battalion? "Sir, we've lost contact with vehicles 5 through 8. His radio operator reported, voice cracking with tension. "Mueller's half-track is completely destroyed." Eric lowered his binoculars, his mind racing to comprehend the tactical disaster unfolding before him. Another shell whistled overhead, striking with devastating precision. The 5th Panzer erupted in flames, its ammunition cooking off in a deadly symphony that sent the surviving crew scrambling into the snow. "Order immediate dispersal," he commanded, his voice hollow even to his own ears. "Tell all units to seek cover in the tree line." But the order came too late. The narrow forest road had become a death trap. Vehicles couldn't turn around, couldn't maneuver past their burning comrades. Panic spread through the column like wildfire as another shot rang out, somehow finding the fuel truck despite the smoke and confusion. The resulting explosion rocked Schmidt's tank, nearly throwing him from the hatch. The heat seared his face even from this distance. Through watering eyes, he watched his men abandoning their vehicles, scrambling into the woods without direction or purpose. "How many guns are firing on us?" he demanded. "Unknown, sir," came the reply. "They're changing positions too quickly to track." The German commander felt something unfamiliar creeping through his chest. Fear. Yes, but something worse. Humiliation. His first independent command was collapsing around him, and he couldn't even identify the force responsible for his defeat. "Signal a general retreat," Schmidt finally ordered, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "All units fall back to Point Delta." As he dropped back into the tank, closing the hatch above him, Eric knew the retreat would be as disorganized as the advance had become. His carefully planned operation, meant to be the cornerstone of his military career, had been utterly dismantled by what seemed like ghosts in the forest. Somewhere on that ridge, an enemy he couldn't see had outmaneuvered him with devastating efficiency. The Panzer's engine roared as it began to reverse, but Lieutenant Schmidt already knew the truth. His defeat would be complete, and his reputation would never recover. Corporal Leonard Hayes had once filled out transfer papers, convinced he wasn't cut out for the stress of tank warfare. The forms remained folded in his breast pocket, forgotten now as he worked in perfect synchronization with Ray Thompson. What had started as reluctant cooperation had transformed into something extraordinary, a partnership that needed no words. "Shell loaded," Hayes announced, his movements fluid and precise as he slammed another round into the breech. The interior of the N-10 Wolverine echoed with the metallic clang of spent casings, and the acrid smell of cordite filled their lungs. Ray nodded almost imperceptibly, his eyes never leaving the periscope. The gunner's hands moved with surgical precision, adjusting the traverse wheel by fractions. Hayes watched those hands, steady, confident, purposeful, and found himself mirroring their calm. 3 o'clock, moving fast, Ray murmured. Sam Harlan, understanding immediately, shifted the tank destroyer without waiting for elaboration. The three men had developed a shorthand that transcended formal communication. A gesture, a glance, a single word, each carried volumes of meaning that would have required paragraphs of explanation to an outsider. The M10 rocked as another shell tore from its barrel, finding its mark with devastating accuracy. Hayes felt a surge of pride as the distant explosion confirmed another hit. This wasn't just luck or blind courage. This was Ray's methodical mind at work, calculating trajectories and weak points with uncanny precision. "We're making history, aren't we?" Hayes whispered during a brief lull, sweat streaming down his face despite the December cold. Ray didn't answer directly, just passed him his notebook for a moment. Hayes glimpsed diagrams of tank formations with annotated weak points, the exact pattern they were exploiting. The loader realized then that Ray hadn't been improvising. He'd been preparing for this moment, studying vulnerabilities that conventional tactics overlooked. As they repositioned again, Hayes caught a glimpse of Ray's face in the dim light. The gunner's expression revealed no pride, no thrill of victory, only intense concentration and quiet resolve. This wasn't about glory for him. It was about solving a problem, protecting their position, keeping them alive. The radio crackled with distant commands they chose to ignore. Captain Langston's voice faded into background noise as the crew continued their deadly dance. Hayes realized he no longer feared court-martial or reprimand. Something more important had taken hold, a sense of purpose, of being exactly where he needed to be. When Ray called for another shell, Hayes had it ready before the words left his mouth. Their movements had become so synchronized that they functioned as extensions of a single will. In the chaos of battle, they had found an unexpected clarity, a silent partnership forged in fire that would bind them long after the smoke cleared from the Ardennes. Captain Douglas Langston sat hunched over a field desk in the command post, 3 miles behind the ridge. His fingers, stiff from the cold, gripped a pen as he began drafting the formal reprimand. The words came easily at first. Willful disregard for direct orders, reckless endangerment of equipment and personnel, breach of established protocol. The captain paused, rubbing his temples where a headache was forming. "Sir, another report from the forward observers," a young communications officer said, handing him a hastily scribbled note. Langston scanned the paper, his brow furrowing. The German column wasn't just stopped. It was decimated. 8 Panzer tanks disabled, 3 half-tracks destroyed, and a fuel truck explosion that had effectively blocked the forest road. All from one M10 Wolverine that had been ordered only to observe. He set the pen down and stared at the half-finished reprimand. 22 years in the Army had taught him that discipline was the backbone of any effective military unit. Orders existed for a reason. Private Thompson had violated the most fundamental principle of the chain of command. "Any casualties on our side?" Langston asked. "None reported, sir. Thompson's crew is intact." The captain stood and walked to the map pinned to the wooden wall of the command post. He traced his finger along the ridge where Ray and his crew had positioned themselves. It was a perfect vantage point, one that Thompson had apparently recognized and exploited with devastating effectiveness. Outside, the distant rumble of artillery punctuated the captain's thoughts. If the German advance had continued unchecked, it would have struck the thinly defended Allied position by nightfall. Hundreds of American lives might have been lost. Langston returned to his desk, picking up the reprimand form. The disciplinarian in him demanded completion. Insubordination couldn't go unpunished, regardless of outcome. Yet something else nagged at him, a voice questioning whether rigid adherence to protocol was always the right course. He thought of his own commander in North Africa 2 years earlier, who'd court-martialed a lieutenant for a similar act of initiative that had saved an entire company. That officer now worked as a janitor back in Pittsburgh. "Sir," the communications officer waited expectantly. "Colonel Barnes is asking for your assessment of the situation." Langston looked down at the reprimand, then at the battle reports. Private First Class Ray Thompson had disobeyed a direct order. He had also single-handedly halted a German advance that might have changed the course of the Ardennes offensive. The captain folded the reprimand and slipped it into his pocket, not filing it, not destroying it, just holding it in abeyance as doubt crept into his once certain mind about the true nature of battlefield leadership. "Tell the colonel I'll have a full report after I've spoken with the crew personally," he said finally. Tendrils of gray smoke curled above the snow-laden pines, marking the battlefield like a somber flag. Ray Thompson stood atop the M10 Wolverine, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid Belgian air. The crossroads near Nouville remained intact, a strategic junction that would have given the Germans a clear path toward Allied positions had the Panzer column succeeded. Allied reinforcements rumbled up the narrow forest road, their expressions shifting from grim determination to stunned disbelief as they surveyed the destruction. The pristine white landscape had been transformed into a canvas of war, snow-streaked with black soot, metallic debris scattered like fallen leaves, and the hulking remains of German tanks frozen in their final moments. "Jesus Christ," whispered a lieutenant from the approaching convoy, climbing down from his vehicle. "How many units were defending this position?" Ray exchanged glances with Hayes, who stood nearby loading supplies. Neither spoke of their three-man operation. Captain Douglas Langston arrived with the reinforcements, his face unreadable as he assessed the battlefield. The disciplinarian officer walked deliberately through the wreckage, pausing at the twisted metal carcass of what had been the Tiger tank. He ran his gloved hand across the scorched armor, then looked up toward Ray's position. "Thompson," he called, his voice carrying across the snow. "A word." Sam Harlan, still in the driver's seat of their tank destroyer, gave Ray a concerned look. "Think we're in for it now?" The gunner adjusted his helmet and climbed down, his boots crunching through the frozen crust. Around him, soldiers were already setting up defensive positions, though the immediate threat had vanished with the German retreat. Medical personnel tended to a few wounded men from another unit, who had been caught in the periphery of the battle. The air smelled of cordite, burning oil, and scorched pine, an acrid mixture that clung to clothing and skin. As Ray made his way toward his commanding officer, he passed the charred skeleton of the fuel truck that had created the most spectacular explosion. Its metal frame was still warm enough to melt the surrounding snow. Langston stood with a map spread against the hood of a Jeep, marking positions with a pencil. He didn't look up as Ray approached and saluted. "Sir," Ray said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty churning in his stomach. The captain continued marking the map for several long seconds before finally acknowledging his subordinate. "Private First Class Thompson," he said, "I believe we had orders to observe and report." "Yes, sir." "And yet," Langston gestured toward the destroyed column, "we have this." In the distance, intelligence officers were already examining abandoned German equipment, collecting documents from a half-track that had survived relatively intact. The crossroads, which had been nearly lost, now stood secure, a silent testament to the actions of one gunner who had calculated risk and reward with the same precision he used to aim his weapon. The captured German officer sat shivering in a makeshift interrogation room, his once pristine uniform now stained with soot and engine oil. Hauptmann Wilhelm Bauer had been riding in the communications half-track when Ray Thompson's shells turned the German column into chaos. His eyes still held the haunted look of a man who had witnessed something beyond comprehension. It was as if they knew exactly where to hit us, Bauer explained in halting English to the American intelligence officers. Not random fire, precise, calculated. Like they could see through the trees and knew our formation perfectly. The intelligence team exchanged glances. This wasn't the first German prisoner to speak of the attack with such reverence. What had appeared to be a lucky shot was beginning to sound like something else entirely. 3 hours later, Ray found himself escorted to a farmhouse serving as a temporary command post. The young gunner expected to face disciplinary action for disobeying Captain Langston's direct orders. Instead, he entered a room where 2 officers from intelligence sat with maps spread across a wooden table. "Private First Class Thompson," the older officer began, "we've been hearing some interesting accounts of your engagement yesterday." His tone wasn't accusatory, but curious. The Germans think they faced a coordinated attack from multiple positions. Ray shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, it was just our one M10. That's what makes this fascinating," the second officer interjected. "A single tank destroyer shouldn't have been able to create such devastation. The German signals officer we captured described your attack pattern as methodical and almost supernatural." The room fell silent as Ray considered his response. He hadn't expected his actions to draw this kind of attention. "Walk us through your thinking," the first officer prompted. "Why that particular firing sequence? Why target the third vehicle instead of the lead Tiger?" Ray's mind flashed back to the frozen ridge, to the split-second decision that had changed everything. "I noticed their spacing was too tight for the narrow road," he explained quietly. "On my family's farm, when machinery jams, it's rarely at the front. It's in the middle where pressure builds." The officers leaned forward, captivated by the simplicity of his logic. "So I targeted the 3rd Panzer, sir. Knew it would block those behind from retreating and prevent those ahead from turning back to help." Ray's voice remained steady, matter-of-fact. After that, it was just about maintaining the pressure. The intelligence officers exchanged another look, this one of dawning comprehension. What they had assumed required complex military strategy had come from a farm boy's practical understanding of chain reactions. "Thompson," the older officer said finally, "I think Captain Langston's reprimand might be reconsidered." The military intelligence officers spread Ray Thompson's notebook across the makeshift table in the command post. The pages, worn at the edges and stained with engine grease, revealed intricate diagrams that none of them had expected from a private first class from Kansas. "These calculations," said Major Wilson, tracing his finger along a series of equations, "they're not standard training material." Ray sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap. The notebook had been a gift from his mother, intended for engineering school plans, not war strategies. Yet here it was, filled with detailed analyses of tank formation vulnerabilities. "You've been studying German maneuvers," observed Captain Langston, his voice carrying a mixture of surprise and reluctant admiration. The disciplinarian who had drafted Ray's reprimand now looked at his subordinate with new eyes. "Yes, sir," Ray nodded. "I noticed their columns always maintain the same spacing, the same order. It's their strength, but also their weakness," finished the intelligence officer. "You turned their precision against them." The young gunner pointed to a diagram showing a narrow passage. "The Germans rely on discipline. When their lead tank stops, everything behind it stops in perfect formation. I calculated that taking out the 3rd vehicle would create maximum disruption." Hayes, who had been asked to attend the questioning, watched his crewmate with growing respect. The loader had followed Ray's silent commands during the battle, but only now did he understand the depth of thought behind them. "You deliberately targeted the fuel truck," Captain Langston stated, not asking. "The explosion would block their retreat," Ray explained softly. "On the farm, when machinery fails in sequence, everything behind it collapses. Tanks work the same way." The officers exchanged glances. What they had initially viewed as insubordination was revealing itself as tactical brilliance. "Where did you learn this?" asked Major Wilson. "Nowhere, sir. I observed." Ray's fingers traced the edges of his notebook, The Germans use these same principles against our convoys. I just reverse them." Captain Langston's expression shifted. The strict adherence to protocol that had defined his leadership was being challenged by the undeniable success of Ray's initiative. "Thompson," he said finally, "what you did violated direct orders." The room fell silent. "But it also saved lives and secured that crossroad." The captain closed the notebook and handed it back to Ray. Sometimes the rulebook doesn't account for everything. As Ray accepted his notebook, he noticed Hayes nodding slightly from across the room. Their silent partnership, instead, it was just one man who understood how to turn discipline into vulnerability. Corporal Leonard Hayes sat alone at the edge of the camp, methodically cleaning his sidearm as the Belgian winter sun struggled to pierce through the cloud cover. 2 weeks had passed since that fateful day on the ridge, and something fundamental had shifted within him. Before meeting Ray Thompson, Hayes had been restless, constantly requesting transfers. Believing his talents wasted in a tank destroyer unit, he joined the Army seeking glory, not this endless waiting and watching. But the events near Nouville had rewritten his understanding of courage. "Coffee?" Ray appeared beside him, offering a steaming cup. Hayes accepted with a nod. The two men had developed a language beyond words, a partnership forged in the crucible of combat. The loader studied his companion's calm demeanor, marveling at how the same quiet Kansas farm boy who sketched engineering diagrams had orchestrated the destruction of an entire German column. "Captain wants to see us," Ray said, blowing steam from his own cup. "Court-martial finally coming?" Hayes asked, only half joking. Ray shook his head. "Intelligence debriefing, again." They walked together through the camp, passing other crews who now regarded them with a mixture of respect and curiosity. The ghost crew, some called them. Hayes noticed how soldiers straightened slightly when Ray passed, though the gunner never seemed to notice the effect he had on others. That evening, Hayes declined an invitation to join other corporals at a makeshift card game. Instead, he found himself sketching loading sequences in a notebook borrowed from Ray. He was mapping out ways to shave precious seconds off their reload time. Sam Harlan found him there, hunched over the diagrams. "Never thought I'd see you turn down poker," the driver remarked, settling beside him. "Got more important things now," Hayes replied, not looking up. "Ray's rubbing off on you," Harlan said with a knowing smile. Hayes considered this. Before, he'd measured leadership by volume and bravado. The loudest voice, the most aggressive stance. But Ray had shown him something different. Leadership through competence, through calculated risk and quiet conviction. Later that week, when a replacement crew arrived, Hayes found himself voluntarily showing them the ropes, demonstrating loading techniques with patience he'd never known he possessed. The new gunner asked why their crew worked so seamlessly together. "We trust each other," Hayes explained simply, "and we follow Ray's lead." That night, writing to his mother in Chicago, Hayes struggled to explain how he'd changed. He finally wrote, "I found my place, Mom, not just in this unit, but in myself. Turns out you don't need to make noise to make a difference." He sealed the letter, glancing across to where Ray sat quietly maintaining his notebook of calculations, and knew with certainty he wouldn't be requesting any more transfers. In the aftermath of the Nouville engagement, Ray Thompson's actions became the subject of intense scrutiny. What began as a potential court-martial slowly transformed into something entirely different. Military analysts, initially tasked with documenting his insubordination, found themselves instead mapping the mathematical precision of his attack pattern. The Thompson sequence, as it was unofficially termed in classified briefings, demonstrated how a single tank destroyer could create the illusion of multiple units through calculated repositioning and timed firing. Colonel James Westfield, head of tactical development, spent 3 weeks reconstructing Ray's movements from battlefield evidence and survivor accounts. "It's not just that he broke the German column," Westfield noted in his report. "It's how he identified and exploited the psychological breaking point of an armored formation. By spring of 1945, as the European theater wound down, Captain Douglas Langston received orders to contribute to a new tactical manual. The captain recognized elements of Ray's approach woven throughout the draft document, though nowhere did his gunner's name appear. When Langston inquired about the omission, his superior offered a pragmatic response. "We can't officially endorse insubordination, Douglas, but we can certainly learn from its results." The ripple effects continued well beyond the war's conclusion. As tensions with the Soviet Union escalated, American military doctrine faced a critical challenge: how to counter overwhelming numbers of Warsaw Pact armor with fewer resources. Training centers across Europe quietly incorporated elements of what they called asymmetric engagement patterns, tactical approaches that bore the unmistakable signature of Ray's improvisation. At Fort Knox, instructors began teaching tank destroyer crews to think beyond traditional engagement rules. The emphasis shifted from frontal confrontation to what one manual described as calculated disruption of enemy cohesion, a sanitized version of exactly what the Kansas farm boy had achieved in the snow-covered Ardennes. Hayes, who had witnessed the birth of these tactics firsthand, recognized their origin immediately when he attended a refresher course in 1952 as a staff sergeant. During a tactical exercise, he smiled knowingly as the instructor diagrammed a firing pattern nearly identical to what he had experienced that December day. "Where did this approach originate?" Hayes asked after the session. The instructor, a Korean War veteran, shrugged. "Pentagon tactical development. Been standard doctrine since '49. Hayes never corrected him. Like Ray himself, he understood that some contributions to history remain unattributed. Their value measured not in recognition, but in lives saved and battles won through the quiet application of uncommon insight." Captain Douglas Langston stood before a classroom of fresh-faced lieutenants at Fort Knox, his posture still military perfect despite the years that had passed since the Ardennes. The projector hummed softly as it displayed a tactical map of the Belgian forest, where years earlier he had witnessed the impossible. "Gentlemen, military doctrine is not scripture," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "It's a framework built on blood and wisdom. But sometimes, the soldier who breaks protocol saves more lives than the one who follows it blindly." The young officers exchanged glances. This wasn't the lecture they had expected from a decorated veteran known for his by-the-book approach. Langston paced deliberately across the front of the room. Private First Class Thompson disobeyed a direct order when he engaged that Panzer column. "By every regulation in our manual, I should have court-martialed him." He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. "Instead, I learned perhaps the most valuable lesson of my military career." The captain clicked to the next slide, a hand-drawn diagram from Ray's notebook, now part of unofficial training materials. The intricate calculations showed firing patterns that had become standard practice in tank destroyer tactics. What Thompson understood, and what I failed to see, was that the terrain and enemy formation presented a once-in-a-war opportunity. His mathematical mind calculated what our rigid protocols couldn't account for. A young lieutenant raised his hand. "Sir, how do we know when to follow orders and when to improvise?" Langston nodded appreciatively at the question. That Thompson wasn't reckless. He was methodical. His insubordination came from deep understanding, not impulse. The officer who had once drafted a formal reprimand for Ray now championed his approach. After the war, Langston had requested a teaching position specifically to reshape how tactical decisions were evaluated in the field. "Leadership isn't about enforcing compliance," he continued, his gaze moving across the room. "It's about fostering initiative within a framework of discipline." As the session ended, Langston gathered his materials, including a worn photograph of Ray's tank destroyer crew. He had kept it as a reminder of how his own rigidity had nearly prevented a tactical masterpiece. Later that evening, he wrote another letter to Ray in Kansas, one of dozens sent over the years. Their correspondence had evolved from formal apologies to a genuine friendship built on mutual respect. In each letter, Langston shared how the Thompson Principle was quietly transforming military thinking, one classroom at a time. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the wheat fields as Dr. Martin Geller pulled his rental car onto the gravel driveway of the Thompson farm. 34 years had passed since the Battle of the Bulge, yet the military historian's fascination with the Noeville incident had only grown with time. Raymond Thompson, now 73, moved between his rows of crops with the same deliberate precision he once applied to targeting German armor. His hair had thinned and whitened, his tall frame slightly stooped from decades of farm work, but his eyes remained sharp and observant. "Mr. Thompson," the historian called, clutching his leather portfolio. "I'm Martin Geller from Columbia University." Ray nodded without surprise. Over the years, a handful of military scholars had found their way to his doorstep. Most left disappointed by his sparse recollections, or what appeared to be sparse. "Come on in," the farmer said, gesturing toward a modest farmhouse that had stood since before he was born. Coffee still hot. Inside, the home reflected Ray's methodical nature. Books lined shelves in perfect alignment. Tools hung in careful order, and a drafting table stood in the corner with a half-finished irrigation design. The engineering education he'd finally completed after the war remained central to his daily life. "Your tactics changed tank destroyer doctrine," Dr. Geller said, spreading photographs across the kitchen table. "Yet there's barely a mention of you in official records." Ray poured coffee into 2 mugs, his weathered hands steady. "That's how I wanted it." The historian noticed a small display case in the corner, the only visible acknowledgement of Ray's service. Inside lay not medals, but his mother's notebook, its pages yellowed and worn from that winter in Belgium. "Langston passed away last spring," Ray said quietly, referring to this former commander. "Wrote me letters for 30 years, became a good friend." Dr. Geller nodded, having interviewed the captain years earlier. "He credited you with changing his entire approach to leadership." A small smile crossed the veteran's face. "And Hayes runs a mechanic shop in Ohio now. Still writes every Christmas." The historian watched as Ray tended to a potted plant by the window with the same careful attention he once gave to calculating shell trajectories. The farm operated with clockwork precision. Irrigation tiners, crop rotations, equipment maintenance, all reflecting the mind that had once outmaneuvered a Panzer column. "Most men would tell that story to anyone who'd listen," Dr. Geller observed. Ray Thompson looked out across his fields, where the patterns of planting mirrored the tactical diagrams in his old notebook. "Some things you do," he said simply. "Other things you carry." The military historian adjusted his tape recorder on the weathered kitchen table of the modest farmhouse outside Salina. Ray Thompson's calloused hands wrapped around a mug of coffee as the afternoon light streamed through the window, illuminating dust particles that danced above the linoleum floor. The farm had been his sanctuary for decades, far from the frozen forests of Belgium. "There's something I never told anyone," Ray said, his voice softer than it had been during the previous 2 hours of interview. "I almost didn't take that shot." The historian leaned forward, sensing the weight of this admission. Ray's eyes drifted to the window, to the fields beyond where wheat swayed in patterns similar to those he'd once calculated for artillery. The radio was crackling with Captain Langston's orders to observe only. I had my finger on the trigger, watching that German column through the periscope. He paused, running a hand through his thinning gray hair. Then I saw it, a branch heavy with snow jarred loose by the lead tiger's exhaust. It fell, and the snow cascaded down, one clump triggering another. Ray's expression shifted, as if he were once again inside that cold M10 Wolverine. "It reminded me of my father's grain silo. When I was 12, I watched it collapse after one support beam gave way. The whole structure came down in sequence." The historian nodded, recording every word as Ray continued. In that moment, I saw the German column the same way, a system that could collapse with the right pressure at the right point. He tapped his finger on the table, marking the rhythm of his thoughts. The third vehicle was the weak link. Take it out, and the narrow road would become their trap. Outside, a tractor rumbled past, but neither man acknowledged it. Leonard, Corporal Hayes, looked at me like I'd lost my mind when I adjusted the sights. But when that first shell hit and the chaos started, Ray's voice trailed off. He understood then. Started loading without a word. The historian waited as Ray collected himself. You know what's strange? It wasn't courage that made me fire. It was mathematics. Patterns. The same things I'd been scribbling in that notebook my mother gave me. He smiled faintly. Engineering school would have been easier than war. Ray stood slowly, joints protesting with age, and walked to a small desk in the corner. From the drawer, he pulled a faded, leather-bound notebook. I still have it. Some of those calculations saved lives that day. He handed it to the historian. One small thing, one decision, setting everything in motion. The historian carefully opened the notebook, finding yellowed pages filled with precise diagrams and equations. The handwriting of a young man who had changed the course of a battle with unauthorized brilliance. Sometimes, Ray said, looking out at his peaceful fields, the right thing isn't in the manual.